shouldn't create space between myself and you guys. Hello. Good. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session today, side event. I'm really privileged to be facilitating this event, but I'm stepping in for a wonderful colleague called Faith Lumonia, who was unable to get her processes of visa in time. But still, we work together closely. Many of us care about the same issues, so I'm really happy to step in. I am called Barbara Nakangu. I work with WWF in the Netherlands. I co-coordinate a program known as the Voices for Just Climate Action, and it's the program that brought us in connection with Akina wa Mama wa Afrika, the co-convener of this event, and the reason for which I stepped in to support Faith facilitate this meeting. And so you all know what the event is about. It's about really focusing on us women and really making sure that our voices are heard in particular topics. And this one in particular is on finance. How do we make sure that really finance gets to the local and really finance creates transformational change? To get into this discussion, we have wonderful panelists. I'm going to request them to introduce themselves, but the process will include introduction. After introduction, each one of them will take us through key messages that we want to take forward from here, and we'll have some good conversations amongst us here. Hopefully we'll have also time to engage with you, and then we'll conclude and the session hopefully with asks and that we should all take forward together. So without much further ado, I'd like to invite maybe I start with Morrison at the end to introduce yourself, please.
Hi, good morning, everyone, almost afternoon. My name is Marissa Hutchinson. I am the Environmental Justice Program Officer with the International Women's Rights Action Watch Asia Pacific in Malaysia, also known as ERAW AP, but also a member of the Facilitative Committee of the Women and Gender Constituency, one of the 9 constituencies attached to the UNFCCC presidency. I'm happy to be here today, and I will pass over to my colleague, Tara.
Thanks, Marissa. I'm Tara Daniel. I'm with We Do, the Women's Environment and Development Organization, and we're a member of the Women and Gender Constituency, which is why I'm proud to call Marissa a colleague. I also am an alternate active observer of the GCF, the Green Climate Fund, for civil society representing developed countries. However, as a member of this GCF Observer Network of civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities, we prepared joint positions across developed and developing country constituencies, which is one of my favorite things about that particular group. And at We Do, I lead our work on feminist climate finance. So I'm really glad to be a part of this conversation.
Fantastic. Welcome, Tara. I'm really looking forward to, hearing more from your experiences, both of you, and tips even on how we can improve together. So we move on to the name. Yes, Andres. Sorry. Andres from Avina, another partner in the VCA. So welcome, Andres, and introduce yourself.
Thank you, Barbara, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us at this event. I'm Andres Mogro. I'm the manager of our climate program in Fundación Avina. As Barbara has said, we're also partners in the VCA, in the Voices for Just Climate Action Initiative. And I just want to say before we begin the event, Fundación Avina is also a managing partner of the Resilience Hub. And part of our responsibilities in that context is to identify spaces where interesting lessons can be learned in the context of the Global South, and they can then be positioned in the context of the Resilience Hub. And we're looking at this as one of the sessions where we can identify those interesting messages coming not just from the panel, but from you as well. So you're welcome to provide any additional inputs that you would like to share with regards to the questions or in the conversation that we'll have at the end of the panel. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Andres. And to start off our discussion today, maybe I start with Marisa again, to set for us the stage on where we are right now with women and climate finance and what we want to achieve. Because as key instruction that I agree with that was given to me is that we need to get past the, just having gender responsive finance, but to getting finance that leads to transformation. Just give us a bit of background or at least context that will shape our discussion today.
Okay. Hi again. Marissa from ERAL AP, but also the Women and Gender constituency, so I'll be very brief. I'll give my colleagues the opportunity to share. But in the context of gender and women, women and girls and other marginalized communities like indigenous people, etc., tend to be significantly undersourced and unappreciated as it relates to the current crises, with the climate crisis being one of the most pressing at this time. So the current oppressive and extractive systems and structures in the economic spectrum are responsible for many barriers encountered by these persons. In the context of climate finance, capitalism has ensured that the hegemony that controls development finance and determines who gets what and how they get it is also influencing climate finance today and how it is dispersed or will be dispersed, hopefully. Countries that are in physical distress and whose communities are also facing the brunt of the climate crisis are being offered loans as a way of financing for climate responses. And there are also visible factors like the very complex climate finance landscape that requires countries to apply for accreditation in order to be able to access financing. Whereas communities that are being required to write proposals are unable to write those proposals because they're more than likely don't have the capacity to write those proposals. Whereas communities are basically living their daily lives fighting for survival. The invisible systems and structures, neocolonialism, imperialism, sexism, racism, capitalism, social norms, and other issues in terms of the cultures, ableism, and ageism also contribute to this issue in terms of who gets financing, how financing is dispersed, but more importantly, how it would be used. And we continue to see the increasing vulnerability of the most marginalized as the climate crisis unfolds. Representation is no longer enough as the Global South needs immediate financial support to ensure its existence. And we want governments to not only acknowledge the increased harm and vulnerability that haunts communities, but to step up and commit to resourcing communities, also organizations, feminist organizations, and movements towards gender equality and climate justice. Ambitious climate policies, funding, and plans at all levels do not reflect the true realities of those grappling the most with the impacts of the extreme and rapid onset climate events. The impacts of these events on their lives and livelihoods, especially communities inclusive of rural, indigenous, and Black communities, and also people living with disabilities, LGBTIQ people, and other marginalized people, cannot only be matched with words and statements of concern, support, and solidarity, but also require financial support that contribute to their sustainability. Movements like the feminist movement, women's movements, and others continue to work to support women and girls and these vulnerable communities to raise their voices to demand climate justice for all and to say no to false solutions that continue to displace their nations, their communities, and their families. But finance is still required for processes by and for the communities, inclusive of capacity building, awareness raising, advocacy, all towards a feminist leadership and participation model. To close, fair and timely climate reparations from developed countries and climate financing from governments to support relief, recovery, and resistance for local communities, indigenous communities, as well as women's rights organizations and movements is key for sustainable climate justice finance. Allocated finance, which is reliable, transparent, intersectional, and flexible to support the needs of these communities is important, and this is the only way that we can achieve climate justice.
Fantastic, Marisa. That's a fantastic background. You've indicated to us the issues, the underlying issues, the invisible issues, things we need to do. We need to go beyond just making statements, but we need to go into the doing exactly. Fantastic, and you've really elaborated the tangible, specific things we need to do. Let's move to Tara. Share with us some of those things, some of those solutions. You say you have an enviable job of mobilizing voices of those that are often not seen, even within the women's groups like indigenous, people and women in developing countries. So share with us, share with the team here, your experiences of some of these solutions that you've done, and again, the challenges that we just need to take forward.
Yeah, thank you so much. So what you were saying is so integral and so pivotal that we have to have the voices of those that have been historically marginalized and underrepresented in these processes. And the good news is that there is now this overall sense that that's an accepted way of working, that we're moving towards that. I think the question of how we do that is still very much on the table. And I think the ways that we do that are meaningful are still questions to be asked. And so this is the first thing, that we want to make sure that we're looking at women and girls in their full diversity with all of their intersecting identities being included, fully participating in projects. But the question is what does that mean? Because we're often seeing that operationalized. It's at a much later stage of the projects. And we're seeing in some ways, the same old stakeholder consultations that aren't true opportunities for engagement, that they might be opportunities for input, but they're not opportunities to really shape the entire direction and trajectory of the projects. So what I would say is that the transformation that we need to be moving towards is from this idea of talking about gender and climate finance as an issue of women and girls leadership and participation and representation, to truly thinking about what are feminist climate solutions, what are the activities that we're already seeing that are being led on the ground with a feminist perspective, being led by people of all genders, that are truly challenging restrictive gender norms, that are truly opening up space for more rights, for more access, for more opportunities, and making sure that those solutions are the ones that are being brought and scaled from the get-go. And so rather than having these climate projects that are then saying, well, we need to make sure that we have women's voices, and including those after the fact or at a much later stage of project development, instead saying, what are these community-led, locally led solutions that are inherently feminist in nature, and how can we be helping to support and resource and scale and replicate those at the level that we need. This is not about making sure that we have more women and girls as beneficiaries. It's about making sure that we're changing our entire approach to how we're thinking about climate finance projects. And I think that's the moment that we're really in, that there are lots of tools and resources right now for better integrating gender within climate finance projects. And we can talk about those and what that really means and the barriers to still having that done well. But if we're truly going to reach this point of feminist climate finance, we have to change the model that we're using. And we also have to make sure, as Marissa was talking about, the scope and the depth of the need, that we're not just talking about transforming the current climate finance that we have, because it's not enough. There's not enough on the table. And if we do not have enough, we cannot advance gender equality, we cannot advance climate justice, and these things are intertwined. So how do we increase the size of the pie and then deliver it in more feminist ways? Those are the questions that I'm hoping that we'll continue discussing here today.
Fantastic. And I think my experience, and most of us here know, it's not often by accident that groups that are marginalized are marginalized. And so many of these things have to be hard fought for. So it would be nice for you to share some of these strategies and experiences of really making sure that, you know, we achieve the transformational change we desire, we need to have. But on one, because as you highlighted, there are two angles to this. We have to get the funding right, enough of it, and as well as make sure that the programs that are coming, you know, that are being funded are actually meaningful. And so the risk of that is being fragmented. Either you focus on this and then it comes and then it's too late, especially for people who are so far off on this decision-making table. So what strategies do we have, or how are we addressing or engaging this difficult challenge of really engaging power? Yes, Marissa, you seem to want to. And then we'll get to
okay, I think one of the key ways in considering gender responses finance is going beyond, you know, the gender mainstreaming approaches and basically tackling or analyzing power structures in place, and also addressing those power structures and the systems in place and how we can change that to ensure that the processes are more, I don't want to say adjusted, but they're more fit women, because we know women already have challenges with finances, and it isn't only specific in the context of climate change. There's simple things like they don't have access to finances, and then women tend to be the ones who are in debt often, not just the country, but women often in debt. There are not a lot of opportunities for women to borrow finances. So in the terms of climate change, when we talk about gender response financing, how can we ensure that women have access to these resources, especially women on the ground, but then also more specifically those most marginalized, women living with disabilities, rural women, especially who bear the brunt of climate change, indigenous women, like where do these resources go? How do we ensure that these resources get to the women who need them? Because for me in the Caribbean, women, we don't have a lot of specific NGOs for climate, but what we do have are a lot of women organizations who do that work, who focus on relief and recovery. And these resources are coming from these organizations who are already doing work on GBV, they're already doing work around sexual reproductive health and right, etc. So how can we ensure that these resources then get to these women's organizations also, and that the women then on the ground impacted significantly do have the opportunity to access resources that in turn supports their resistance basically in pushing through the climate crisis, because there's no real opportunities for women to receive these funds through the government otherwise. So how can we ensure that when funds are allocated, we say, oh yes, we're having a loss and damage fund or facility, etc. How do we ensure that the women on the ground, the groups on the ground, indigenous communities, rural communities access those funds? That's one of the ways in terms of interrogating power structures, but also addressing them.
You know, Marissa, I want to emphasize what you just said. I think that actually often funding comes and the expectation is to set up a climate change fund, and that these women can't access this financing because they're not doing climate change work. I think it's really important for us to emphasize that it's holistic. What is there is what we need to work with and strengthen that. Because often starting new things is actually the way to keep people out. Fantastic, thank you. So I'll go to Andres. We have, Marisa and Tara have talked about the underlying challenges that we are facing, what we need to do. Can you share with us some examples, practical lessons of some of the things that you have done or others have done that we can take, as inspiration from in this room?
Thank you, Barbara. I want to bring the experience of what we've been doing with Fundación Avina and trying to mobilize these resources from traditional sources of finance or international sources of finance to the local level, working with women groups and indigenous peoples and local communities. And I want to begin by saying that the work that has been done in the finance world in terms of methodologies and indicators and governance and climate rationality and everything you have to do and to follow to develop a project, while useful, is sometimes an imposition on the ground and on existing governance schemes and on existing data information systems and on existing participatory schemes. So sometimes it's difficult to comply with what traditional finance expectations are and what the reality is on the ground. And what we've learned in that context, and we're working on an initiative now where we are financing a couple of projects in the Global South, in Latin America, in Africa, and in Asia called BASE, or BASE, which is short for Building Approaches to Fund Local Solutions with Climate Evidence. We're trying to rethink the way in which climate rationality is developed from local groups on the ground. And we are... The logic behind this is that the international data or international science on what the impacts are of climate change, what the possible scenarios are, what the solutions are by region has gone to a point where it's duplicatory to ask of specific communities in those areas where international science is saying these types of things are happening, these are the types of solutions that need to be financed, ask the same thing. So we're trying to bear the weight of reducing the kind of information that we request of proposals and think of a different way in which you can do that. And we've developed a form, basically, which is a checklist of what is happening on the ground, what types of solutions can be financed, and in that form we have specific questions with regards to the issue of gender and how minorities are being represented, what the impacts are within minorities, how these groups are participating in the development of the project and will need to participate in the implementation of the project. And we're relying very much on local governance mechanisms to develop these forms and to come up with the data and indicators that are available at the local level, without that meaning that we need to impose anything in terms of indicators or methodology or what some colleagues of ours are calling new colonialism in terms of climate, and not the fact that we're all in the climate world aware of what's happening, what needs to be done. We tend to have the tendency of going to local communities and saying, I know your problem better than yourselves. And we know the solutions that you need to implement better than yourselves, and that is absolutely not something that never has to happen. And we're taking that collaborative way of constructing solutions from the ground as the start, as the get-go, even forgetting that climate change exists and that there are climate impacts in those specific communities when we begin those conversations. When those conversations are started, because we're not necessarily participating in those spaces, and I think that's important as a lesson that we've been learning in the implementation of these funds. The idea is to reach the conclusion once these projects are finished next year, reach the conclusion that this is a feasible way of working and implementing climate climate projects and bring that reflection back into the climate finance world and speak with other financing agencies and implementing entities of the GCF, and hopefully get a reform in the way in which traditional finance is working with local communities, because in our experience, a very small percentage of those resources are reaching local communities, in particular, like I said, women groups, indigenous peoples. So we're trying to bring that reflection in this pilot way in which we've started this program back into the finance world and hopefully create some change there. But it's definitely been a learning experience. One of the biggest difficulties that we've identified there even is the language barrier, because working in English or in French or in Spanish or in Portuguese, which are the 4 languages in which we've launched this call for proposals and we're implementing projects, is not necessarily reflective of all the languages in the Global South. So that's been a challenge even for ourselves. And we're trying to handle that in the best way possible. We've had projects, for instance, in Indonesia with local languages, and there are different dialogues in Indonesia, not just one. And that's been a challenge, but we've tried not to let that mean that the project can't be looked at and that we can't have a conversation with the community. So there's a big effort there. But hopefully once we accompany the implementation of these projects, and I forgot to say this, and I'll close soon because I don't want to hog the mic. Each of the projects that we're implementing is going to be accompanied by a researcher, a local researcher. And the role of the local researcher is to continue developing the climate rationality of the project as the project is implemented, so that you take the opportunity of learning by doing instead of needing all these capacities and all this data and all this information and methodologies to already be in place before you even begin the project. So we have researchers on each of these 8 projects that we're financing Latin America, Africa, and Asia, accompanying the implementation of the project and developing the information with the communities on the ground as the projects are implemented. And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'll ask the audience to really seek clarifications or ask questions for more, input or understanding of some of this, because the BASE initiative is really a really good initiative that I'd encourage people to look at. But yeah, Tara and Marisa, any other, because I know there's so many ideas out there that we need to really harness and learn from rather than reinventing wheels. So Tara?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Now, I'd love to respond and continue this conversation. One of the things that you were bringing up is this idea of really localizing the finance. And we know right now that is a desperate need, that when we try and figure out how much finance is flowing to the local level, that estimates are that it's as little as 10%, and that it's very difficult. I had colleagues recently at PACTA and German Watch try and calculate how much GCF funding for projects across the entire continent of Africa was flowing to the local level, and they were really unable to work with the entities that were implementing these projects to get that level of data. This is not something that is being valued in terms of how we have the methodology of where the actual dollars are going. And so I think this is a question too about how we create systems to monitor what we want to see. And then that brings into ultimately also how we are monitoring. And I love this idea of making sure that we're using local governance systems as the basis. And we did some research a few years ago at WeDo on recommendations for better integration of gender within climate projects. And one of the big takeaways from that was ensuring that you will be working with a local researcher, that you're working with local gender expertise. Whether that local gender expertise exists in the form of an individual or in the form of a women's organization or another gender-related group, because so often this gender piece has been outsourced, and and the person who is creating the plans doesn't have that knowledge of local gender dynamics. So when we're really talking about thinking about how do we bring it down at the local level, there's multiple factors across the entire system that we need to be building up the capacity to do better, including working in multiple languages. Even the fact that you're able to work in 4 languages, I think, is a step above so many funding sources, and then to still recognize that that's not enough. So we also have to start thinking about what are these regional structures that need to be set up so that we're truly having access in all languages and that we're operationalizing language justice. Even I saw an application recently for funding that said, okay, you can do your application in languages other than English, but can you still make your title in English? So it's still the default. And we still need to recognize that if we want these solutions, if we want these agroecological solutions, if we want these solutions that are integrating sexual and reproductive health and rights and climate justice, if we want these solutions that are focused on land tenure and access for women to have titles to their land, and to really draw from the incredible wealth of these community-led, locally-led solutions, then we have to start creating a climate finance infrastructure and architecture that can fully respond to that.
Marisa, you want to add to that? Any lessons and experiences that we can share with others? Because I think a bit of the biggest challenge we have is that this is a humongous challenge, huge challenge, that we have to work on and navigate from both specific perspective, what we do in Uganda, where I come from, and yet we also have to influence global systems. And then also the urgency to get this done. So any experiences that you can share with everybody on lessons where you have been successful?
Yeah, I wouldn't add too much more than what my colleagues Andres and Tara has said. But again, coming from the Caribbean, one of the SIDS areas, but also still very much marginalized, as in, the Pacific is pretty much more dominant than the Caribbean. What we realize in the Caribbean now is that, again, as I mentioned, most groups who focus on relief and recovery when it comes to climate, and with relief and recovery being one of the key things and not so much thinking about mitigation and adaptation, because it's not that the knowledge isn't there, the knowledge is there, but it is who is holding the knowledge, the same way who's holding the finance, right? We realize that a lot of the groups in the Caribbean, what they also lack, sadly, is the capacity to understand when it comes to mitigation, when it comes to adaptation. So then how do we get them to understand gender-responsive financing in this context? So for us, well, a smaller group, I should say, in the Caribbean of feminists working to resource the Caribbean region, especially groups who are doing the intersection of climate, but also of gender, in terms of ensuring that there's that gender perspective, that persons understand that funding is needed, and women, girls, and marginalized communities need that funding. We're working to actually resource these groups to do capacity building, because capacity building is very important, but also in order to move forward in advocating with their governments to ensure that there are projects that can inform and can support the work that these groups are already doing. There are environmental groups in the Caribbean, very few. Most of them fall under a youth group, but they're not doing the specific gender work. They're resourced by government, but then, the government has specific criteria you have to fit, and the project has to look like what the government wants it to look like, and not specifically what these groups want to do. So that has become one of the challenges also. So thinking about how we can be more feminist, be more, flexible in terms of what that approach looks like, but also how we can ensure that governments on their end have, as Tara said, local resource persons who have a gender background, not just coming from bureaus, but civil society, who can engage specifically with the government, who doesn't only bring the gender perspective, but they also bring the community perspective, that governments have a better understanding of why they should finance communities on the ground, how they should finance them, but more importantly, why, is one of the key ways I think that we can move forward in being more strategic in terms of funding communities. And specifically with climate finance and with everything that's happening with the loss and damage fund, ensuring that those funds get to where they need to be. I think that is one of the main starts that you have to do. You have to have local persons being a part of the conversation, being a part of the inputs, but also being a part of the data collecting processes, as Andre said. We can't just have persons continue coming in. One example, I want to use is specifically Guyana. Guyana has an indigenous community, and the issue is that the indigenous community feels that only outsiders come into their community to do that data. Governments do not resource the local groups, like the forestry groups, those kinds of groups, to actually go in and do the research. And if they do, they're simply accompanying what, again, they call as an outsider or islander. They're not specifically bringing other indigenous groups. They're not specifically bringing someone in government who is at least local that they know. So how can we ensure that there's not constant, infiltration of these groups? There's the constant need to build trust, etc. But we're allowing these outsiders to come into the communities, and then they take the data and they use it in the ways that they want. And communities never see this data ever again or this information. So how can we ensure, again, that finance on the ground properly resources the communities on the ground?
Yeah, I think what is really important, and I think most important, is to really get these communities to be the ones not that actually get to a level where they are representing themselves, so that then they're asking these questions. My last question to you before we open to the... You want to say something?
Yes.
Okay. Please go ahead. This is a conversation for all of us. Go ahead.
I'm sorry for interrupting, but I know one of the things that we're discussing is what are the challenges of channeling climate finance at the local level.
Yeah.
And we tend to have, when we think about climate finance, everybody thinks about the GCF. And that's the first thing that comes to mind. And usually what governments even tend to do when they fulfill the responsibility of going to the ground or speaking with subnational actors about climate finance, they talk about the GCF. But there's a thing with the GCF, and the biggest challenge there is that you need an official letter by a national designated authority saying, I am in agreement with this project. And that, we have seen, is the biggest challenge for any project aimed at the GCF coming from local communities, because there are criteria that need to be fulfilled from the point of view of a national designated authority. That includes, for instance, that any project that is aimed for the GCF needs to be at least a project of $10 million. And $10 million is not necessarily reflective of local needs sometimes, because the GCF is sadly a source of funding that is not interested in projects that are less than $10 million, and neither are implementing agencies that are accredited to the GCF. Now, the second bigger barrier there are instruments of climate finance. By instruments, I mean the type of climate finance that you receive, either grants, loans, concessional, or other types of concessional finance. And when you look at the entire spectrum of climate finance worldwide, you have over 90% is refundable finance. And sometimes the capacities of local communities to access that type of finance limit what sources they can aim to. And the GCF is one of those sources that is prioritizing refundable finance more and more every day. And the response to these challenges, which might be a little obvious, is that knowledge to pressure national governments or to create those links, those engagement frameworks with national governments is key. Even though the developments in international policy, like the gender work under the UNFCCC, have taken too long, the Lima work program on gender that was adopted in COP25 establishes commitments on gender for countries. So it's an excellent leeway for subnational local actors or gender groups to come to the government and say, we want to know how you're planning to implement the Lima work program on gender. Because the Lima work program on gender includes many things that governments have to do, regardless of whether or not they want to. And some of those include empowering women as agents of action, for instance. Or now governments have to have a national climate change gender focal point. So I think making a link with the obligations, the commitments that governments have undertaken with regards to gender and climate change is important, because that opens the door to potentially handling these obstacles with regards to relations to the GCF, for instance, or other sources of financing that are dependent on national governments. Most traditional sources of climate finance are dependent on national governments. So there needs to be a strategy for any local groups, communities, indigenous peoples, or women to engage with the government, regardless of whether or not that relation has been good. Traditional finance, sadly, will require there to be an engagement and there to be a relation and support for that to happen. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you, Andres. I think you preempted my question, which is exactly this, that practically, what can we do right now to really enable women, local women, indigenous women access this financing? And you highlighted them, these public financing, GCF financing that is for them. How do we make sure that the conditions, we contribute in making sure these conditions, practically what we do, that we contribute to making these conditions accessible, that actually it's not loans, but it's grants, that the conditions in the country enable rather than block, So I don't know whether you have more examples on how we can do this practically now, that this is the major topic in this COP and this discussion. How do we practically get the discussions that has been happening? Tara, you mentioned it very well. The recognition now, at least this general, the environment is good, that there's recognition that funding needs to get to the local, women need to be included. Now, how do we make sure that we hold these people accountable and we follow through? And it really leads to that change that we aspire for. I wanted to open to the audience, to the audience to participate, but maybe Marisa and Tara, you wanted to add to that. Practically, moving from here, what do we need to do, each one of us here?
So one of the things that we do have to do is, even though there's a recognition that gender equality is a part of climate finance, is we have to challenge the narratives that are working against the actual establishment of direct access and meaningful small grants funds. And some of those narratives, as you were just saying, have to do with the provision of finance and how it's being provided. The idea that a loan is more effective than a grant. We have to challenge that. We have to recognize that the most effective and transformative and sustainable climate finance can indeed be grant-based finance when channeled to the local level. We also have to reframe the entire conversation around risk. There seems to be, and this is something that's talked about in the Green Climate Fund, this idea of an appetite for risk, but that's applied only to really incredibly large, as Andres was talking about, projects that had to be at least 10 million. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars projects, a huge scale, that they're given this leeway and said that there's this appetite for risk, that it's worth the risk on these projects. But somehow we haven't recognized that the incredibly low risk of channeling funding through direct access mechanisms at the local level is worth it as well. And the risk there might be that we do indeed have to provide more supportive resources, that we do have to provide capacity strengthening and language justice. But those risks are so much lower and so much worth taking compared to these top-down approaches. So this idea of what's effective, and I've even heard how much bang for our buck can we get? Well, investing in feminist climate solutions is going to be excellent bang for your buck, but it's not going to only show up in the ways in which the return on investment is being calculated by these very large projects with the methodologies and the accounting that they're setting up. So we have to also create this expectation that we can be talking about qualitative outcomes and knowing the gender transformative elements that we want to see within projects as well that might not be captured by the numbers and that will in fact involve lots of work with local researchers in order to truly tell those stories and capture what's on the ground. So I know all of the answers that I've just given have to do with challenging narratives, and I was asked to say something very practical, but I think it has to go hand in hand. Yeah. And so, for example, right now, there is now a window under the GCF for projects that are under $10 million, the simplified approval process, but we have to make sure that indeed we are supporting entities to be able to prioritize that and for the GCF to prioritize that. So things that we can do are follow processes. The Green Climate Fund also has a window for enhanced direct access that had room for up to 10 pilot projects, and there have only been 3 that have come through. So if we want to follow the GCF, for example, there is a GCF observer network of civil society, indigenous peoples, and local communities that are providing input and advocating on specific policy directions of the GCF, but then we can also leverage, as Andreas was saying, the infrastructure that's set up around gender. Unfortunately, a lot of the national gender and climate change focal points that have been appointed are not liaising directly with their national designated authorities or any other entities that are working on climate finance. So how can we advocate to make sure that there is that level of cohesion and coherence in how parties are approaching gender and climate finance, and also resourcing and providing appropriate platforms for national gender and climate change focal points and others at this intersection of gender, of finance, of climate to strengthen their capacity so that we can really achieve this system that works and that also appreciates, as you were mentioning earlier, like the truly holistic nature that we can be working with health ministries as well. And when we're talking about these solutions, we have to have a more cross-cutting approach. So let's think about those entry points for some of our advocacy.
Marissa, as specifics like Tara, I mean, Tara mentioned the projects under 10 million. Tara mentioned enhanced access where only 3 projects have been approved. Those are opportunities we need to work on. The GCF Observer Network, we need to engage it. Why isn't it effective? Is it effective? What else could we do? Tara mentioned we have gender focal points in the countries, but maybe they're not liaising with NDS. What do we need to do here to make sure that happens and benefits people who are not there? Specifics.
Okay, very specific and also very grassroots, because that is first my background. What I wanted to say is I think there needs to be a level of trust of communities also. With Euro Asia Pacific, we work broadly with the Global South, but a lot of our work takes place in Asia. And what I've realized with Asian communities, especially indigenous communities, these communities are able to do their research themselves because they know their specific context better than anyone else. So yes, maybe a local researcher may come in or a gender focal point may come in and discuss with them and share, but they come up with their own technique for how they would do this research. And it's very good. I'm not going to say it's good because these are groups I work with, but they do a really good job. It's very thorough, and they acquire this research in a way that, because they have the knowledge, because they are living it every day, especially the indigenous communities within these regions, and especially in the Mekong region where I work specifically on a water governance project. These women actually do their own research. The women leaders within their community, whether it has to do with the impacts of the patriarchal water governance structure and how it impacts their communities, because the women are the people collecting the water. The women are the persons who are going to the rivers to get water and sadly are sexually assaulted by corporations and corporation leaders. These women then also still have to come out to their communities, be strong as they say, and support their families. But they're able to say which corporations, they know better than everyone, who is coming into the communities, what they're bringing, how they're polluting their water, how it would impact their health. Like, they're able to actually do that. So I think that also taking account of what communities can do for themselves, but also finding ways when we think about financing, ensuring that finance safeguards communities and the ways in which they live day to day is also a big part of it. But I don't know who we approach to this, who we say that this is necessary, but all of that is a big part of climate finance, and safeguarding of these people's lives and livelihoods should be a big part of it.
Thanks. So turn to the audience. I think all of you, many of you, I think here are, I think we are speaking to the converted already. I mean, we know the arguments, they're very, very clear. Let's go to specifics of what we need to do here in this meeting, the conference. Or, I mean, we do what WEDO does, what Fundación does, but some of you are doing fantastic work. Can we share on specifics that we can do from here, the negotiations that are going on, that we can really take forward from here with, tangible actions? But you can also ask for clarity, ask examples for people, for the panel to share. Yes, please. I don't know whether there's a microphone to go around.
Thank you very much. I'm from International Network for Sustainable Energy, and we are also working on local solutions in East Africa and South Asia. And what we did is that we find out similar problems like you had, and what we did is that we made an online database of local solutions, and we figured out this about the language problem is really important. I mean, you never reach out to the women and also to the local people if you don't have a translation. So what I propose and what we found out that some of these materials has to be translated, has to be distributed, and has to have a lot of pictures, because people don't know. I mean, I met people here in UN conferences, and some people have never seen a two-pot improved cook stoves. So, I mean, if you go out, you need to have pictures, materials, and translations. It's very important. Yeah.
Your name? If people here want to connect with you, what is your name, please?
My name is Judith Soletsky, and I'm from the International Network for Sustainable Energy. Okay. And actually, we have a side event on this on Wednesday.
Fantastic.
If somebody is interested, inforce.org.
Thank you. Any other examples on how we can engage international financing systems practically to really create the change we desire? Yes. Introduce yourself and then please share.
Bom dia, não sei se é boa tarde. Meu nome é Avina. Eu vim do Brasil, do Pará, de uma terra indígena, do povo Paracanã, de recente contato. Eu represento o meu povo Paracanã como presidente da Associação Tatoá. É uma honra estar aqui com vocês, dizer que nós, povos Paracanã, nós somos povos que estão sofrendo esse impacto de mudanças climáticas. Em visão geral do povo, o sofrimento muito grande, quanto para os indígenas e quanto para os animais que são biodiversidade. Eu agradeço e obrigada.
Thank you very much. My name is Venatoa, and I am from Brazil. I represent the Paracanã people. We are an indigenous people from that has recent contact. I'm here representing the Paracanã people as the president of the association, and it is an honor to be here today. the people of Paracana community, we are suffering this impact regarding climate change. And I'm here to bring the perspective of the indigenous communities that we are suffering with the animals that represent our biodiversity. So that's my statement.
Could she share any examples or ideas, if it's okay, if she's able to, on how financing could, ideas on how financing could get to the local, to them? How are they going about it? Who are they lobbying? Where their challenges are, etc.
Então, antes de a gente vir para cá, a minha chegada até aqui, o povo paracanã se reuniu. Como poderia chegar nessa conclusão? Como que podemos pedir ajuda? Como que a autoridade de vários países que se preocupa com floresta em pé, como que eles podem ajudar com recurso para recuperar a floresta que foi derrubados e outras coisas. Então, como o povo paracanã tem associação, então poderia nos ajudar através da nossa associação. O recurso poderia ser depositado diretamente na conta da associação. Isso nos deixaria feliz e poderia nos dizer que recebemos ajudas, e o que a gente quer também recuperar o que foi destruído, e nós precisamos recuperar o nosso oxigênio que recebemos da floresta. Então, se não tiver a floresta, nós não podemos ter esse ar, que é o oxigênio que ser humanos precisa.
The Paracana people has their own association, and one way could be helping the association with resources that can help with the recovery of forests that have been devastated, among other things. So one of the things that would make them happy would be receiving help to recover what has been destroyed, considering the need to receive oxygen from the forest. And if there is no forest, there is no oxygen.
Thank you very, very much for mentioning that, and I'm glad that you did. Often, the systems, the processes that we need to engage are already in place. We do not need to reinvent or start new ones. We just need to make sure they are resourced. So thank you for mentioning that, and we really need to make sure that we recognize that and work with those systems that are in place already. Any other comment, any other addition, inspiration? Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Faith Nataya, and I work with the Indigenous Information Network in Kenya. And a lot has been said, and I agree. Lots of communities are going through a lot of challenges, especially indigenous peoples, impacts on climate change. And just one thing that my organization has done over the years is to look for funding, I guess, to ensure that they also come to these spaces to talk about their own issues, not just having people speak for them. And I also coordinate a youth group from my community. And I would say one of the challenges that we experience with access to funding sometimes is also with the requirements that are put to apply for that funding. For example, they would say if you want to apply, you should maybe have a 2-year what would I say? I'm looking for a word for this. Let me just. Yes. No, not a portfolio.
Experience, kind of.
No,
yeah?
You should have, for example, a 2-year account maybe of what of the funding you have used. So, and then so if it's 2 years and you haven't had any funding, or you're just starting out, then it's not easy to also have that and submit that to also get the funding. And I mean, if you're also starting out, then you do not have a $50,000 budget that you've already used, and so it's not easy to also provide that when you're doing your proposal. So it's also hard to get the funding for that matter. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for raising that practical example. Any other one last one, and then we can come back to the panel.
Hi.
Okay.
Yes.
Others, yes.
Actually, mine is not an example, but a question.
Yes.
I'm Aya De Leon from the Philippines. I work on legal and policy issues, including gender and climate change. And I was just wondering, when we talk about climate finance, especially to respond to gender needs, are we talking only about climate dedicated sources and trying to ensure they respond to gender needs, or can we also talk about other funding sources or channels and making them more climate and gender responsive? So, like, just so we have a broader set of financial sources that we can access. Thanks.
I think that's a very important comment, actually, that, climate finance is so limited, but there's so much funding for development, for infrastructure, for water. All that should be accessible for transforming, women's lives, and addressing, Yes.
Bom dia a todos e todas. Eu sou Daniela Silva, de Altamira. Sou mulher preta da Amazônia. E enfim, eu ainda estou entendendo esse espaço. Peço desculpas, é a primeira vez se eu errar. Mas eu acho que essa temática de gênero e financiamento é ainda uma coisa que é ainda muito distante da nossa realidade. As nossas organizações de base, elas têm dificuldade de acessar esses recursos. Primeiro, eu acho que foi falado pela questão da língua, né? Infelizmente, os espaços eles são pensados de poder, são pensados uma narrativa ainda muito eurocêntrica, né? Acho que a gente está nessa luta para compartilhar mais isso. Está tudo bem aí? E, assim, a minha sugestão é que, quando for fazer um projeto de financiamento, que tenha que as pessoas que são impactadas, por exemplo, por grandes empreendimentos, são impactadas por uma barragem, que é a barragem de Belo Monte. Então, que as pessoas que sofrem impacto desse empreendimento, e as mulheres são as que mais sofrem com os grandes empreendimentos, elas tenham prioridade a acessar esse recurso. E que não tenha muita burocracia. Porque a gente faz o trabalho de base, a gente não tem tempo de estar na burocracia. A gente está na luta, no dia a dia, construindo, propondo a realidade, indo no governo. Então, que seja menos burocrático o acesso, para que a gente consiga, de fato, acessar esse recurso. Porque, enquanto houver burocracia, quem está na base não vai conseguir acessar esses recursos. Então, se a gente quer equidade, se a gente quer realmente derrubar essas estruturas de desigualdade, a gente tem que parar de fazer os processos muito burocráticos. Obrigada, desculpe se eu falei muito.
Good morning. My name is Daniela Silva. I'm from Altamira. I'm a Black woman from the Amazon. I'm still figuring out this space. I'm a Black woman from the Amazon. I'm still figuring out this space. It's my first time here, so I do apologize if I'm not on topic or if I'm not right. This topic of financing is very distant from our reality still. The local people, the base, they have very they struggle a lot to access resources. The main topic, I believe, that was said is the language barrier. Unfortunately, power spaces are thought about in a narrative that's still Eurocentric. And we are in the fight, so for us, we do not have the time for the bureaucracy. A suggestion we have is whenever you have financing projects, the people who are impacted by large enterprises, for example, a dam, and I am from Altamira, impacted by Belo Monte Dam, the women are the ones who suffer more from this kind of enterprise. So women should have priority in this research for funding. And there shouldn't be a lot of bureaucracy. The bureaucracy, they are imposing, they are preventing these groups to have access to the resources. As long as there is bureaucracy, local government, local communities can never have access to it.
Thank you so much for raising that. And I think I picked two key points for me. I think one important one that you're emphasizing is bureaucracy, but I think you're also emphasizing from your comment the challenge of these huge investments that come. Those huge investments actually should be the target for influencing the gender, aspects in those projects. Because that should be the starting point. Because now climate finance is limited, coming now, and it's too even limited to make any impact and effect on these investments that are already there. So I think the two comments are aligned. The comments from the lady from Philippines saying, actually, should we be only targeting climate finance, or actually all forms of finance? Because I think she gives a very good example. And I think I go back to our panel here to try and come to a conclusion. Comments on what the audience have shared. Each one of you. Andres, you want to start?
Sure. Thank you. And to start, I want to say muito obrigado pelos comentários em português. I think it's great to have people on the ground talking about their experiences. And just to respond to Aya's question, I think your question is great. I think we have to do both things. I mean, to have gender responsiveness in climate finance and climate finance responsiveness in gender finance. But there's always a risk to both and to either. And I want to bring back this conversation to what is being reported globally as climate finance. There's a big problem there, and normally what happens when you tick something as climate finance and it doesn't have a climate impact, because the idea of mobilizing climate finance and the commitments behind climate finance is to help local communities tackle climate. But if you open that door for donors to just say, if whatever it is you do, to your understanding, has a climate impact, then just tick the box and report it as climate finance, then you reduce that capacity of communities and beneficiaries to access resources. And we've seen, you probably must have seen this week, a report was issued on Reuters that spoke about the different types of finance that is being reported as climate finance. You have countries saying that because they finance the movie in the developing countries and the movie has to do with nature, then it's climate finance that is being provided to developing countries. And I wouldn't want that to happen, in particular in gender finance being climate responsive, because it undermines the climate needs of local communities. So as long as you can guarantee that climate finance will have a climate impact and will actually help communities with the needs that are being derived from climate, I think it is something that we need to do. But the criterion needs to be there for that to happen. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Alfredo. I think that is really important. I think to emphasize that they're both needed and they're both important to keep separate. Climate finance should be additional. Yeah. Sarah.
And was so glad to hear so much sharing in this room, because I know this room is full of knowledge of what these solutions really look like. And I think this is one of the answers is how do we develop directories and ways of sharing so that these solutions can not only be showcased to everyone that needs to understand that this is going to be the heart of the transformation we need, but also so that we can build better support and resourcing networks and collaborative structures with that. I would mention that the Women and Gender constituency has an annual program, the Gender Just Climate Solutions, and we have a directory of over 150 feminist solutions that is accessible on the Women and Gender constituency website, womengenderclimate.org. And that, in fact, the launch for the call for the latest Gender Just Climate Solutions is actually launching today. That email will go out at some point if you are connected with the Women and Gender constituency. But what we're doing from that is also trying to figure out this question of how do we address the barriers, which are absolutely far beyond just language, but have to do with the entire structure of what finance is accessible and all of the challenges to accessing that from a bureaucratic perspective, the financial expenditures, sometimes having to be a registered organization when you've been operating as a community group or a grassroots network, all of these things. So we've been trying to address that by following up with everyone who has been recognized as a Gender Just Climate Solution since this program's gone on since 2015, and offering them additional small grants through a very streamlined process because they've already been identified, in order for us to try and do this work as a feminist organization and as part of a feminist collaborative of identifying what processes can be streamlined so that we can say to those that have much more resources, look, this is a feminist funding model and this is what you should be supporting. And to this question too, it's not just about transforming our existing funding models to truly prioritize small grants that are accessible, and that are grants for climate justice, which can include grants for advocacy if indeed you are being hurt by a false solution in your community. That is a climate justice grant. And this is about mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage and advocacy across the whole gamut, and understanding that in our small grants programs as well, that we also, of course, need to unlock more funding for this. And because these are holistic approaches and integrated approaches, there does need to be more finance from any source. I think the call for new and additional climate finance over the years has been wonderful in some ways, and saying that we recognize that this has to go above and beyond the obligations that were set for member states for their development finance commitments. But in other ways, it's now created this bifurcation between climate and development that is sometimes resisting these more integrated approaches that we know are truly necessary. So I hope that we can all take forward a way of thinking through these solutions in a more holistic way, and hopefully can identify where we can access those funds very directly for the work that needs to be done.
Marisa.
Yes, to briefly close out, I think echoing what my colleagues Andres and Tara would have said, I think when we think about finance, it goes back to, again, who receives this finance and how it is dispersed. But more importantly, what I would like to echo, especially hearing from our colleague from the Amazon, I don't recall her name, the last speaker. Pardon me? Danielle. Oh, that's good. That's my middle name. Danielle. When you think about bureaucracy, I mean, sometimes there's no way in which we could think about dismantling it. We do have ideas, but when you're within the system, it's very hard to think about. So I guess more importantly, to ensure that when we talk about women and girls and those most marginalized, how do we ensure that exclusion is no longer. So how do we work on exclusion? But also how do we think about being rid of false solutions? We know that in different contexts, etc., there are different false solutions which have been introduced, and we ourselves are not very sure of how we actually sometimes think that these solutions work, because sometimes we know no better. And sadly, as communities, we do have our knowledge, our capacities, our science, but being introduced, especially by governments, sometimes we fall victim to utilizing solutions that do not fit the people. They're just for show for governments. I hope no governments are here to kill me for saying that. But in terms of addressing this, especially thinking about reparative justice for women, for girls, for indigenous communities, etc., and whatever that looks like, in a more thought process in terms of who preserves biodiversity, conserves biodiversity, we have to acknowledge that these communities are doing it, not governments. And if governments have these facilities or institutions which do it, at the end of the day, it's better done by indigenous communities, even rural women who also work within these institutions. And finally, thinking about, when we talk about finance, we should think about who is in the room when finance is being discussed. Often it wouldn't be communities in any way, but how can we hold our governments accountable to ensuring that climate finance that rightfully belongs to those communities on the ground who are significantly impacted, that they receive those resources, whether it comes with a fight, a struggle, and a perfect example of this has been Malaysia, indigenous communities, who they walk into rooms when they're not invited, and they take up space. And it's really amazing to watch. They walk into rooms, they take up space, they demand their voices are heard. Indigenous men protect the indigenous women, that they can speak. And honestly, when they walk into rooms, the government representatives, they move because they're scared, but they know they're also doing this in a very wrong way, that it doesn't include communities. So I think pushing power and supporting the power that communities already have is also one of the ways in which we ensure that finance, whatever that communities need to move forward in order to survive the climate crisis, is there.
Thank you. It's 1 o'clock on the dot. I hope you have enjoyed this and you've got some ideas, and this was continuing the conversation, but really to share with you experiences, the issues we still have to engage. And yeah, thank you very much, Marissa, Tara, and Andres. I keep calling you Alfredo. That's why I keep calling. I don't know why. Andres, thank you so much for this wonderful, and thank you so much the audience. You've been wonderful listening in. And yeah, let's continue this fight.